You were born to scrub floors, not to dream above your station." The words hit Lyra like ice water thrown across her face. Lady Celeste's voice carried the particular brand of cruelty that came from absolute certainty in one's superiority, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the last. Lyra felt them settle into the familiar hollow space in her chest where all such declarations lived, a collection of truths she had learned to carry without flinching. She kept her eyes fixed on the stone floor of the castle kitchens, her hands never pausing in their scrubbing of the great oak table that would soon hold the feast preparations. The coronation was only days away, and every surface in the royal kitchens had to gleam with perfection. Lady Celeste had made it her personal mission to ensure that even the lowliest servants understood their place in the grand ceremony that would officially crown Alpha King Kale as the rightful ruler of the Northern Territories. "Look at me when I speak to you, mongrel!" Lyra's wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin, a dangerous flutter of defiance that she quickly suppressed. She had learned long ago that her beast was more trouble than protection in a world that had already decided her worth. Slowly she lifted her grey eyes to meet Lady Celeste's perfectly sculpted face, noting the way the noblewoman's lips curved in satisfaction at the gesture of submission. "Better? Now, as I was saying, the coronation preparations require absolute perfection. The Alpha King cannot be embarrassed by sloppy work from servants who don't understand the magnitude of this moment." Lady Celeste's golden hair caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, creating a halo effect that seemed to emphasize everything Lyra was not. Beautiful, powerful, worthy of standing beside a king. "Yes, my lady?" The words came out steady, despite the way Lyra's hands wanted to shake. She had perfected the art of appearing unaffected, of letting cruelty slide off her like water off stone. Lady Celeste's pale blue eyes narrowed with something that might have been disappointment at not getting a stronger reaction. "The ancient crown will be moved from the vault today for the blessing ceremony. You will ensure that the ceremonial chamber is spotless. I trust even someone of your limited bloodline can manage not to touch what doesn't belong to her." The mention of the crown sent an unexpected shiver down Lyra's spine. She had only glimpsed it once, years ago, when she had been tasked with cleaning the upper corridors. The artifact had been briefly displayed during a visit from the high scholars, and something about its presence had made her wolf pace restlessly for days afterward. Ancient power seemed to radiate from the twisted silver and moonstone creation, as if it held memories of queens whose names had been lost to time. "Of course, my lady, I would never presume to touch something so sacred." Lady Celeste smiled then, the expression sharp enough to draw blood. "Good, because if I find so much as a smudge on that chamber, I'll ensure you spend the coronation scrubbing the dungeon floors instead of watching from the servants' gallery." She swept from the kitchen with practised grace, her silk gown rustling against the stone floors like whispered threats. Lyra waited until the sound of her footsteps faded completely before allowing herself to breathe fully again. Around her, the other kitchen servants slowly resumed their work, eyes carefully avoiding hers in the way that had become as familiar as breathing. That afternoon, Lyra made her way through the castle corridors toward the ceremonial chamber, her cleaning supplies clutched tightly in hands that had seen more hard work than most nobles endured in a lifetime. The ancient stone walls seemed to press closer as she climbed the spiral staircase, and with each step, the strange restlessness in her chest grew stronger. The ceremonial chamber doors stood open, guarded by two of the royal sentries who barely glanced at her as she slipped inside. The room itself took her breath away, as it always did. High vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows, and stained glass windows cast jewelled light across the marble floor. But today there was something else. The crown. It sat upon a pedestal of black marble at the far end of the chamber, and Lyra's wolf went completely still at the sight of it. The artifact seemed to pulse with its own inner light, moonstone catching and reflecting the coloured glass patterns until the entire room felt charged with ancient energy. Without thinking, she took a step closer, then another, her cleaning forgotten entirely. Something was calling to her. Something impossible and dangerous, and completely against everything she had ever been taught about her place in this world. The crown was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly. Silver worked into intricate knots and spirals that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking straight at them. Moonstone cabochons that held depths like still water under starlight. It was a queen's crown, meant for someone with power and grace and royal blood running through her veins. Everything Lyra would never be. Her wolf stirred again, pressing against the barriers she had built to keep the beast contained. For just a moment she could swear she heard something like a voice, ancient and feminine and proud, whispering words she couldn't quite understand. "What are you doing here?" Lyra spun around so fast she nearly dropped her cleaning bucket, heart hammering against her ribs as she faced one of the royal guards. His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, and his expression suggested he was already considering whether a servant had any business being alone with the most precious artifact in the kingdom. "Lady Celeste ordered me to clean the chamber, sir, for the blessing ceremony tomorrow." She held up her supplies as evidence, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The guard studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the corners of the room. "Get on with it, then, and stay away from the crown. That's not for the likes of you to be gawking at." "Yes, sir." Lyra threw herself into her work with desperate focus, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, while carefully avoiding looking at the pedestal again. But she could still feel it there, that presence that made her skin prickle with awareness, and her wolf pace in restless circles beneath her ribs. When she finally finished and gathered her supplies to leave, she risked one last glance at the crown. For just an instant she could have sworn the moonstone caught the light in a way that looked almost like recognition, as if the ancient artifact was watching her with the same intensity she felt whenever she looked at it. Impossible. She was nothing but a servant with mongrel blood and dreams too big for her station. But as she closed the chamber doors behind her, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed forever. The grand arena had been transformed into a theatre of destiny. Thousands of witnesses packed into every available space to observe the trial that would determine the fate of the Northern Territories. Lyra stood at the arena's edge, the ancient Lunar Queen armour fitting her like a second skin, while power hummed through her veins in waves that grew stronger with each passing moment. The crystalline sword at her hip pulsed with recognition, responding to royal blood that had been hidden for too long. Above her in the royal box, Alpha King Kale sat motionless as carved stone, his newly acquired crown catching the morning light while his dark eyes remained fixed on her with burning intensity. Lady Celeste beside him radiated satisfaction, her engagement ring glinting as she gestured to nobles who had come to witness what she believed would be the final elimination of any threat to her position. "Behold the ancient crown of the Lunar Queens!" Master Aldrich's voice carried across the arena as he placed the legendary artifact on a pedestal at the arena's centre. "Let it serve as prize and proof. Only one of true royal bloodline can claim what belongs to them by right of blood and destiny." The crown blazed with inner light the moment it was exposed to open air, moonstone and silver, responding to Lyra's proximity with supernatural recognition. Every wolf in the arena felt the pull of ancient authority, their beasts responding to power that predated the current dynasty by centuries. Sir Marcus Blackthorn entered the arena like death given form, his massive frame encased in black steel, while his enhanced strength made the very ground tremble beneath his feet. Everything about him spoke of professional violence and absolute conviction. This was a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. "The accused stands charged with practicing dark sorcery upon our Alpha King," the herald's voice boomed across the arena. "Let trial by combat determine the truth, as witnessed by gods and men." Sir Marcus drew his sword with practised ease, the blade gleaming with runes that spoke of enhancement magic and supernatural sharpening. "I fight for king and country against the dark sorceress who would corrupt our realm through forbidden arts." The crowd roared approval as their champion prepared to eliminate what they saw as a threat to natural order. But Lyra's enhanced senses caught something else, the scent of fear beneath Marcus's righteous fury, the way his enhanced abilities couldn't quite mask his recognition that she was far more than she appeared. "I fight for truth," Lyra's voice carried clearly across the arena, touched with authority that made several nobles shift uneasily in their seats. "Let the gods judge which of us stands in the light." The starting horn's blast shattered the morning air like thunder. Sir Marcus attacked with devastating speed, his enhanced strength driving his blade toward her heart in a strike meant to end the combat before it truly began. But Lyra's partially awakened abilities let her see the attack coming like it was moving through honey, her supernatural reflexes carrying her aside while her crystalline sword rang against his steel. The clash sent shockwaves through the arena, supernatural forces meeting in a display that made the watching crowd gasp with awe and terror. Marcus's enhanced strength was formidable, but Lyra's royal bloodline carried power that had been forged in the crucible of ancient wars. "Impossible," Marcus snarled as his killing blow was turned aside by a servant who should have died instantly. "No mongrel has the strength to match blessed steel." His next attack came in a whirlwind of enhanced speed and fury, each strike calculated to exploit what should have been her inferior training and bloodline. But with each moment of mortal danger, Lyra felt more of her suppressed power, breaking free from the magical barriers that had contained it for 20 years. Her movements became fluid, graceful, touched with the fighting style of queens who had carved empires from wilderness and tamed dragons through force of will alone. The crystalline sword in her hands began to sing with harmonics that spoke of metal forged in starfire and tempered in the tears of ancient gods. "She grows stronger," someone whispered in the noble section, their voice carrying across arena suddenly gone quiet, except for the ring of steel on crystal. "How is she growing stronger?" Sir Marcus pressed his attack with desperate fury, realizing that his overwhelming advantage was slipping away with each exchange. His enhanced abilities were considerable, but they were artificial augmentations grafted onto ordinary bloodline. Lyra's power came from genetics that had ruled when the world was younger, and magic flowed like rivers through the land. The turning point came when Marcus managed to land a grazing blow across her shoulder, his blessed blade drawing royal blood for the first time. The scarlet drops hit the arena sand and ignited like liquid fire, power responding to injury with explosive force. Silver light erupted from Lyra's form like a star being born, ancient magic finally breaking through, the last of her suppression barriers in response to mortal threat. Her partial transformation began in earnest, wolf features manifesting with royal authority that made the watching crowd fall silent with supernatural awe. Her eyes blazed silver fire that could be seen from the highest seats. Her strength increased beyond anything Marcus's enhancements could match, and her speed became something that belonged more to legend than reality. The crystalline sword in her hands resonated with power that made the very air sing with harmonic frequencies. "Lunar Queen," Master Aldrich whispered from the arena's edge, his ancient voice filled with wonder at witnessing the awakening of power that had slumbered for a generation. "Behold the bloodline that conquered darkness itself." Sir Marcus stumbled backward, his righteous conviction wavering as he faced something that challenged every belief he held about natural order and proper hierarchy. This was no dark sorceress wielding forbidden arts. This was royal authority manifesting through bloodlines so pure it made his enhanced abilities feel like parlour tricks. "What are you?" he gasped, raising his sword in defensive posture that spoke more of fear than aggression. "I am Lunar Queen Lyra Moonborn," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through every wolf in the arena. Last heir of the silver throne, rightful bearer of the crown of storms, and mate to the Alpha King by right of supernatural recognition. The declaration hit the assembled crowd like physical force, ancient authority demanding acknowledgement from lesser bloodlines. In the royal box, Alpha King Kyle surged to his feet as his wolf howled with recognition and triumph, his mate finally claiming her true identity before the entire realm. Sir Marcus made one final desperate assault, throwing everything he possessed into a killing strike meant to end the impossible threat before him. But Lyra moved like liquid moonlight, her crystalline blade finding the gap in his armour with precision that spoke of supernatural guidance. He fell to the arena sand with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent amphitheatre, defeated but not killed, his enhanced abilities no match for power that had been forged in the heart of creation itself. The arena erupted into chaos as thousands of witnesses tried to process what they had just observed. A servant had revealed herself as queen, ancient bloodline had triumphed over enhancement magic, and the political order of the Northern Territories had just been turned upside down in front of everyone who mattered. But Lyra's attention was focused entirely on the crown that sat gleaming on its pedestal, calling to her with irresistible authority. Each step toward it felt like walking through destiny itself, power recognizing power in a moment that would reshape the realm's future. She lifted the crown of storms with hands that shook only slightly, feeling the weight of centuries settling on her shoulders as ancient magic recognized its rightful bearer. The moment the moonstone touched her forehead, the arena exploded with silver light that could be seen from the castle walls. The coronation was complete. The Lunar Queen had returned, and the Northern Territories would never be the same. The crown of storms blazed with ancient light as it settled upon Lyra's brow, 20 years of magical suppression finally shattered by the undeniable truth of her royal bloodline. The arena had fallen into stunned silence, thousands of witnesses struggling to process the impossible transformation they had just observed. A servant had become a queen before their eyes, ancient power manifesting with such overwhelming authority that even the most sceptical nobles felt their beasts bow in instinctive recognition. Master Aldrich stepped forward, his ancient voice carrying clearly across the vast space as he began the formal coronation rite that had been interrupted 2 decades ago by war and treachery. "Behold Lunar Queen Lyra Moonborn, last heir of the Silver Throne, rightful ruler of the Northern Territories by blood, by power, and by the crown's own recognition." The genealogical magic woven into the crown of storms activated in response to his words, projecting silver light that revealed Lyra's complete royal lineage for all to see. Names and faces of lunar queens stretching back through centuries appeared in the air above the arena, each one bearing the distinctive silver eyes and regal bearing that marked their bloodline. "Princess Seraphina's granddaughter," gasped Lord Blackwood, his political calculations crumbling as he realised the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "The lost heir lives." But even as the crowd struggled to accept this reshaping of their world, Lady Celeste was not prepared to surrender the power she had spent years manoeuvring to claim. Her pale face twisted with fury as she rose from the royal box, her voice cutting through the arena's awed whispers with desperate venom. "This is exactly the kind of deception I warned you about," she declared, pointing an accusing finger at Lyra's crowned form. "Dark sorcery designed to create false genealogies and counterfeit bloodline displays. Do not be fooled by these elaborate illusions." Her words sparked uncertainty among the assembled nobles, political creatures who understood the devastating implications if Lyra's claim proved legitimate. Everything they had built their power upon, the established hierarchy, the planned alliances, the careful balance of influence, would crumble if a true Lunar Queen had returned to reclaim her throne. "The crown itself recognises her legitimacy," Master Aldrich replied, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. The genealogical magic cannot be counterfeited, cannot be influenced by any sorcery known to our realm. This is truth manifest through artifacts older than memory. But Lady Celeste was beyond reason, her desperation driving her to increasingly reckless gambles. "Then we reject the Crown's authority," she announced, her voice rising to carry across the arena. "The Northern Territories will not be ruled by pretenders and false queens, no matter what ancient trinkets they manage to activate." The declaration was nothing less than open rebellion, a challenge to the fundamental laws that had governed their realm since its founding. Around the arena, nobles began choosing sides with the swift calculation of those who understood that neutrality was no longer an option. Alpha King Kale had heard enough. He rose from his throne with fluid grace, every line of his body radiating the controlled power that had made him the most feared ruler in generations. When he spoke, his voice carried across the arena with absolute command, silencing even Lady Celeste's desperate protests. "I reject the political engagement that was arranged without consideration of supernatural law," he declared, his dark eyes fixed on Lyra's crowned form with burning intensity. "The mate bond supersedes all political convenience, and I claim Lunar Queen Lyra Moonborn as my true partner, before gods and witnesses." The crowd erupted into chaos as the Alpha King publicly shattered the engagement that was supposed to secure crucial political alliances. But Kale's attention was focused entirely on descending from the royal box to the arena floor, crossing the sand with determined strides that brought him to where his mate stood blazing with ancient power. "My queen," he said quietly, dropping to one knee before her in a gesture of respect that sent shockwaves through every noble watching. "My mate, my equal in all things." Lyra's wolf sang with triumph as she looked down at the man who had chosen love over political expediency, who had publicly claimed their bond despite the chaos it would unleash. She extended her hand, and when their skin touched, golden light blazed between them as the mate bond snapped into perfect completion. "My king," she replied, her voice carrying the harmonics of royal authority as she helped him rise. "My mate, my partner in ruling justly rather than conveniently." Their public claiming sent visible shockwaves through the arena, supernatural recognition so powerful that every wolf within miles felt the completion of a bond that had been ordained by forces beyond political manoeuvring. But Lady Celeste was not finished. "This will not stand," she shrieked, her composure finally cracking under the weight of absolute defeat. "I have spent years building the alliances that keep this realm stable. I will not watch them destroyed by a mongrel servant and her enchanted king." Her desperate words triggered exactly the response Lyra had been waiting for. The accusation of enchantment in the face of obvious mate bond completion was treasonous enough, but what followed sealed Lady Celeste's fate entirely. "I hired the assassins," she continued, her desperation making her reckless with confessions that condemned her before thousands of witnesses. "I ordered the poisoning attempts. I would have gladly watched this pretender die rather than see her destroy everything I built." The admission of attempted murder sent ice through the arena, noble and commoner alike, recoiling from the casual evil that Lady Celeste had just revealed. Several of her allied lords immediately stepped away from her position, recognizing that association with admitted assassination attempts would destroy their own political futures. "By your own words you stand condemned," Kale's voice was arctic with controlled fury. "Attempted murder of a lunar queen is treason of the highest order, punishable by exile or death." But even as guards moved to arrest the woman who had orchestrated so much suffering, Lyra stepped forward with the kind of merciful authority that would define her reign. "Exile," she declared, her voice carrying across the arena with supernatural resonance. "Let Lady Celeste and her co-conspirators depart these lands forever, stripped of titles and holdings. but let them live to contemplate the price of choosing treachery over truth. The merciful judgment sent murmurs of approval through the crowd, many recognizing that a new kind of leadership had just announced itself. Justice without unnecessary cruelty, strength tempered with compassion. As Lady Celeste was escorted from the arena in disgrace, her supporters scattered like leaves before a storm. The remaining nobles began the swift realignment that would define the new political order. Lords who had hesitated to support an untested servant now competed to offer their loyalty to a proven Lunar Queen whose power had been demonstrated before thousands of witnesses. "The coronation ceremony will proceed as planned," Master Aldrich announced, his ancient voice filled with satisfaction at witnessing the restoration of proper order. "But it will crown two rulers united by supernatural bond as well as political wisdom." The formal mating ceremony that followed was conducted before the entire assembled crowd, ancient rites that bound not just two hearts but two bloodlines in partnership that would reshape the realm's future. When Kyle and Lyra exchanged vows of eternal devotion, golden light visible to every witness confirmed that their bond had been blessed by forces beyond mortal understanding. "I love you," Kyle whispered against her lips as they sealed their union with a kiss that sent waves of supernatural recognition through every wolf in the arena. "And I love you," she replied, her words carrying the weight of destiny fulfilled and love triumphant over every obstacle that had tried to keep them apart. As the crowd erupted in celebration, fireworks painting the sky with bursts of silver and gold, Lyra stood beside her mate and king while wearing the crown that had always been meant for her. The servant who had scrubbed floors had become the queen who would rule with wisdom and justice, her mate beside her as equal partner in the great work of building a realm worthy of the love that had transformed them both. The Northern Territories had their true rulers at last, and the future blazed before them like the silver light of ancient magic made manifest. 6 months had transformed the Northern Territories in ways that still took Lyra's breath away. She stood on the castle balcony that had become her favourite retreat, watching the bustling courtyard below where former servants now worked alongside nobles in positions earned through merit rather than birthright. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined their world had given way to something far more just, though the transition hadn't always been smooth. Lost in thought again, Kyle's voice carried warmth and affection as he joined her at the stone railing, his presence still sending pleasant shivers through the mate bond that connected them. "Marvelling at how different everything looks," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth as his arms encircled her from behind. "Do you remember when I was terrified to even look directly at you?" His laugh rumbled against her back, rich with the contentment that had settled over both of them as they'd grown into their roles as co-rulers. "I remember thinking my wolf had gone completely insane for wanting a servant who seemed determined to remain invisible." Below them, the afternoon training session was concluding with former kitchen staff practicing alongside seasoned guards, part of Lyra's initiative to ensure that everyone in the castle could defend themselves and others. The woman leading the sword work had once served beside Lyra in the scullery. Now she commanded the castle's new integrated defence force with skill that impressed even the most traditional military advisors. "Any regrets?" Lyra asked quietly, the question that sometimes surfaced during these peaceful moments when the magnitude of the changes they'd wrought became clear. "Only that it took so long to find you." Kale's answer was immediate, accompanied by a gentle kiss pressed to the top of her head. "Every political alliance I might have lost was worth gaining the mate the gods chose for me." The political landscape had indeed shifted dramatically. Several noble houses had initially resisted the new order, but when their attempts at rebellion were met with swift, merciful justice rather than the brutal retribution they'd expected, most had chosen adaptation over exile. Those who couldn't accept a world where worth was measured by character rather than bloodline had departed for other realms, leaving space for fresh voices and innovative ideas. "Speaking of gods and choices," Lyra turned in his arms, her hands settling on his chest as she prepared to share the news that had been confirmed that morning. "It seems they have another gift for us." Something in her tone made him go very still, his enhanced senses no doubt detecting the subtle changes that had been developing over the past weeks. "Lyra, I'm with child." The words came out soft with wonder, still difficult to believe despite the healer's confirmation. "Our heir will be born before the winter snows." The joy that blazed in Kyle's dark eyes was bright enough to light the entire castle, his wolf howling with triumph while he lifted her and spun her around the balcony with careful exuberance. When he finally set her down, his hands cradled her face with reverent gentleness. "A prince or princess with your compassion and intelligence," he whispered against her forehead. "The realm will be fortunate indeed." "And your strength and determination," she corrected, her own hands covering his. "This child will grow up knowing their worth was never in question, never dependent on the approval of others." The contrast to her own childhood wasn't lost on either of them. Where Lyra had been raised believing she was nothing, their heir would be surrounded by love and acceptance, taught to value substance over status and justice over convenience. "The council meeting went well this morning?" Kyle asked, his political instincts never fully at rest, even during personal moments. "Better than expected. Lord Ashford's proposal for the new trade agreements was surprisingly progressive, and Lady Blackwood's educational reforms passed with only minor modifications." Lyra smiled at the memory of nobles who had once dismissed her every word, now seeking her approval on matters of governance. They're learning that effective leadership comes from listening to people who've lived different experiences. As they spoke, the setting sun painted the castle walls in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the courtyard where their people continued their daily lives in safety and prosperity. The transformation hadn't been without challenges, but every difficulty overcome had strengthened both the realm and the bond between its rulers. "Do you ever miss it?" Kale asked quietly. "The simplicity of believing you were just a servant with no greater destiny?" Lyra considered the question seriously, remembering the girl who had scrubbed floors and endured cruelty while dreaming of nothing more ambitious than surviving another day. "Sometimes I miss the invisibility," she admitted, "but I would never trade the ability to protect others for the comfort of hiding from responsibility. Even when that responsibility includes formal dinners with visiting dignitaries who still can't quite believe a former servant sits on the Lunar Queen's throne. Especially then." Her smile was fierce with the confidence that had grown stronger with each challenge overcome. "Every time someone is shocked by my presence in positions of power, another person realizes that worth isn't determined by circumstances of birth." As if summoned by their conversation, Master Aldrich appeared in the balcony doorway, his ancient face creased with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see ancient prophecies fulfilled. "Your Majesties," he said, with the respect that had replaced his earlier careful distance. "The evening reports are ready for your review." "Of course they are." Lyra laughed, the sound carrying none of the bitter resignation that had once characterized her interactions with duty. The work of ruling never ends. "But it's work that matters," Kale added, his arm around her waist as they prepared to return to the responsibilities that defined their days. "Work that makes the realm stronger and our people safer." As they walked back into the castle that had once been a prison of hierarchy and cruelty, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From worthless servant to beloved queen, from impossible love to triumphant partnership, from hidden power to claimed destiny. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, being treated as less than, but they had all been wrong. Worth had always existed within her, waiting for the moment when she was brave enough to claim it and strong enough to defend it. "I love you," she whispered to Kyle as they reached their private chambers, the words as true now as they had been in those terrifying early days when loving him had seemed like the most dangerous thing she could do. "And I love you," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of forever. Outside their windows, the Northern Territories settled into peaceful night under the protection of rulers who had chosen love over convenience, justice over tradition, and truth over the comfortable lies that had once defined their world. The Lunar Queen had found her crown, claimed her mate, and built a legacy worthy of the love that had transformed them all. The thunder of hooves announced his arrival before the horns even sounded. Lyra felt the tremor through the stone floors of the kitchen where she knelt scrubbing the hearth, felt it in her bones like an earthquake that started small and built to something that could reshape the world. Around her, every wolf in the castle went silent, ears pricked and heads turning toward the main courtyard as if pulled by invisible threads. Alpha King Kyle had come to claim his throne. She abandoned her scrub brush and moved to the narrow kitchen window, pressing her face against the cool glass to catch a glimpse of the procession that had the entire castle buzzing with nervous energy. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. He rode at the head of a column that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, mounted on a warhorse so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even from this distance, his presence hit her like a physical force, something ancient and powerful that made every instinct she possessed scream both run and submit in the same desperate breath. The Alpha King was everything the stories claimed and more. Tall and broad-shouldered even in the saddle, dark hair caught by the wind, and an aura of controlled violence that spoke of battles won and enemies crushed beneath his will. His elite guard flanked him, wolves whose beasts were so close to the surface that their eyes reflected gold even in daylight, and behind them came the war beasts that served as both companions and weapons in the Northern Territories. Lyra's wolf pressed against her ribs so hard she gasped, a desperate whining sound that she had never heard from her beast before. It was as if the creature inside her was trying to claw its way out of her skin, trying to reach something that called to it with irresistible force. "Get back to work!" The head cook's sharp voice cut through her trance. "The welcoming feast won't prepare itself, and if you think the Alpha King's arrival means you can slack off, you're more foolish than I thought." Lyra jerked away from the window, her hands trembling as she returned to her scrubbing, but the strange urgency in her chest only grew stronger as the hours passed, as if every heartbeat was counting down to something she couldn't name but desperately needed. The great hall had been transformed for the welcoming feast, banners hanging from every pillar and tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and delicacies that most of the servants would never taste. Lyra moved through the organised chaos like a ghost, carrying platters and filling goblets while trying to remain invisible among the sea of nobles who had gathered to witness their new king's first official meal in his own castle. She had perfected the art of being unseen, of moving through spaces without disturbing the important conversations around her. Tonight, that skill felt more crucial than ever, because every instinct she possessed told her that drawing attention would be dangerous in ways she couldn't begin to understand. The Alpha King sat at the high table, like he had been born to rule from that chair, dark eyes scanning the assembled crowd with the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgave even less. He wore his power like other men wore clothing, casual and absolute, and when he spoke, even the nobles at the far end of the hall fell silent to catch his words. Lady Celeste had positioned herself at his right hand, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her golden beauty perfectly. She leaned close to whisper in his ear, her hand resting possessively on his arm, and Lyra felt something hot and terrible twist in her stomach at the sight. Jealousy. Impossible, dangerous, completely inappropriate jealousy over a man she'd never spoken to and never would. She forced herself to focus on her tasks, weaving between tables with a tray of wine goblets, when disaster struck in the form of a stumbling drunk lord who knocked into her shoulder. The tray tilted, wine sloshing, and she scrambled to steady it before the expensive vintage could spill across the noble guests. The effort sent her stumbling backward, directly into the path of a serving girl, carrying a massive platter of roasted fowl. They collided with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire hall, sending her sprawling to the floor in a tangle of limbs and scattered food. The great hall went silent. Lyra's face burned with humiliation as she scrambled to her knees, frantically trying to gather the ruined feast while avoiding the stares of every noble in the room. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her life learning to avoid, the kind of spectacle that would earn her a beating and extra kitchen duty for weeks. "Clumsy little mongrel," someone laughed, and the sound sparked a ripple of cruel amusement through the assembled crowd. She kept her head down, focusing on cleaning up the mess until a pair of black boots appeared in her field of vision. Expensive leather, polished to a mirror shine, the kind of boots that belonged to someone who could have her thrown in the dungeons with a single word. Slowly, dreading what she would see, Lyra lifted her eyes. Alpha King Kyle stood before her, towering and impossibly powerful, his dark gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that made her wolf go completely insane. The beast clawed at her ribs, howling with something that felt like recognition, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they stared at each other across a space that might as well have been an ocean. His eyes were the deep brown of rich earth, flecked with gold that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and something in them made her feel like he was seeing straight through to her soul. Then his wolf hit her awareness like a physical blow, ancient, powerful, royal beyond anything she had ever imagined, and focused on her with a recognition so profound it made her bones ache with the impossibility of it. Mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf or from the ancient presence examining her or from him. But it settled into her chest like a brand, hot and permanent and completely impossible. The Alpha King's hand twitched toward her as if he wanted to help her up, wanted to touch her skin and confirm what his beast was screaming at him. But the movement was subtle, barely there, and he caught himself before anyone else could notice. His nostrils flared slightly, and she realized he was scenting her, his wolf cataloguing everything about her the way predators studied prey, or the way mates learned each other's essence. "Are you injured?" His voice was deep and rough, carrying just enough concern to sound polite, while his eyes burned with something that had nothing to do with politeness. "No, Your Majesty. Forgive me for the disruption." The words came out steadier than she felt, though her wolf was still throwing itself against her ribs in desperate attempts to get closer to him. He studied her for another long moment, and she could see the exact instant when his rational mind reasserted control over his beast. His expression shifted, becoming more distant, more kingly, though something hot and dangerous still flickered in the depths of his gaze. Good. He stepped back, the movement putting proper distance between a king and a servant, though she could feel the effort it cost him. Clean this up. Then he was gone, returning to the high table and Lady Celeste's possessive touch, leaving Lyra kneeling on the floor surrounded by scattered food and the lingering scent of power that made her wolf keen with loss. Around her, the feast resumed as if nothing had happened, noble conversation flowing over her like she was just another piece of furniture to be ignored. But everything had changed. The mate bond hummed between them like a golden thread, stretched thin, impossible to break and dangerous to acknowledge. She finished cleaning the mess with shaking hands, acutely aware of his presence at the high table, of the way his attention kept drifting back to her despite his obvious efforts to focus on Lady Celeste's conversation. When she finally escaped to the servants' corridors, Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The Alpha King's wolf had recognized her as mate. Her beast had answered with the same impossible certainty. But she was nobody, a servant with mongrel blood and dreams too big for her station. And he was a king who needed a political alliance more than he needed a mate bond that would destroy everything he had worked to build. Sleep had become impossible. Lyra lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling while her wolf paced restless circles beneath her skin. 3 days had passed since the welcoming feast, and the strange pulling sensation in her chest had only grown stronger, as if invisible threads were tugging her toward the royal wing with increasing desperation. She could feel him. That was the most disturbing part of this impossible situation. Somewhere in the castle, Alpha King Kyle was awake too, and she could sense his restlessness like an ache in her bones. The mate bond that should never have formed was stretching between them like golden wire, growing thicker and more insistent with each passing hour. When the castle bells chimed midnight, she gave up pretending she could rest. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone floors as she slipped from the servants' quarters and made her way through corridors she knew like her own heartbeat. She needed air, needed distance from the suffocating awareness that was driving her slowly insane. The castle gardens lay in shadow beneath a canopy of stars, ancient trees creating pockets of deeper darkness where a servant could walk without fear of discovery. Lyra breathed deeply of the night air, grateful for the cool touch of wind against her fevered skin. She was not the only one seeking solace in the darkness. The scent hit her first, pine and leather, and something indefinably male that made her wolf whimper with recognition. Then she saw him, a tall figure moving through the moonlit paths with the same restless energy that had driven her from her bed. Alpha King Kyle looked nothing like the composed ruler who had presided over formal dinners for the past 3 days. His dark hair was dishevelled, his shirt open at the collar, and he moved with the fluid grace of a predator too agitated to maintain human stillness. Even from across the garden, she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. She should leave, should slip back into the shadows and return to her quarters before he noticed her presence. But her feet refused to obey, rooting her to the spot as he turned and their eyes met across the moonlit space. The recognition hit like lightning, immediate and impossible to deny. His wolf surged toward the surface, turning his eyes to molten gold, and her own beast answered with a howl that she felt rather than heard. They stood frozen for a heartbeat that lasted eternity. Then he was moving, crossing the garden with swift strides that ate up the distance between them, while she remained paralyzed by the intensity of his approach. "You." His voice was rough with something that might have been relief or desperation. "I thought I was going mad." "Your Majesty." She managed a curtsy, despite the way her hands were shaking, though the formal gesture felt ridiculous when the air between them crackled with supernatural awareness. "Don't." He stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell the scent that made her wolf keen with longing. "Not here. Not when it's just us." The admission hung between them, dangerous and impossible. Here, in the darkness away from watching eyes, he was acknowledging what they both felt, the connection that defied every rule of their world. "I don't understand what's happening to me." The words escaped before she could stop them, vulnerability spilling out despite every lesson she had learned about keeping her thoughts to herself. His laugh was harsh, self-mocking. "That makes 2 of us. My wolf has been trying to tear its way out of my skin for 3 days, and every instinct I possess is screaming at me to find you, to make sure you're safe, to—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair with frustrated violence. "To what?" "To claim you." The words came out raw, honest, completely inappropriate for a king to say to a servant. "To mark you as mine and damn the consequences." The confession sent liquid fire through her veins, her wolf pressing so hard against her control that she gasped with the effort of keeping the beast contained. This was madness, this conversation, this moment where the most powerful man in the kingdom admitted to wanting someone so far beneath his station that acknowledging her existence was political suicide. "You can't." She forced the words past the tightness in her throat. "I'm nobody. You're a king who needs to secure alliances and produce heirs with someone worthy of the crown." Worthy. He stepped closer, and she could see the way his hands were clenched into fists, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her. "Do you know what my wolf thinks of worthiness? It thinks you're the most precious thing in this kingdom, and everyone else is just taking up space." The declaration hit her like a physical blow, so far from everything she had been taught to believe about herself that she couldn't process it. Her wolf surged toward the surface, desperate to close the distance between them, to touch this impossible mate who saw value where everyone else saw nothing. That's not how the world works. But even as she said it, she took a step toward him, drawn by forces beyond her control. Maybe the world is wrong. Another step brought him within touching distance, and she could see the way his chest rose and fell with the effort of maintaining control. "Tell me your name." "Lyra." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Lyra." He repeated it like a prayer, like something sacred that deserved reverence. "My wolf knows your name, has been calling it for 3 days while I tried to convince myself I was imagining this." She should step back, should remember her place and retreat to the safety of proper distance. Instead, she found herself lifting one trembling hand toward his face, fascinated by the way his eyes darkened at the approach of her touch. "Don't." The word was a desperate plea. "If you touch me, I won't be able to let you go." "Maybe I don't want you to let me go." Her fingertips brushed his cheek, and the world exploded. Golden light blazed between them, visible and impossible, racing along her arm and down her spine like lightning made of pure recognition. His wolf roared with triumph, while hers sang with joy, both beasts celebrating the confirmation of what they had known from the first moment their eyes met. Mate. Perfect. Right. Destined. Kyle's hand covered hers, pressing her palm flat against his skin while his eyes burned with supernatural fire. The bond snapped taut between them, no longer a tentative thread, but a golden rope that bound them together with frightening intensity. "This is impossible," she breathed, but she couldn't pull away, couldn't break the connection that felt more real than anything else in her life. "I know." His other hand rose to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. "I have a kingdom to think about, alliances to maintain, a political marriage that's already been announced, and my wolf doesn't care about any of it. Neither does mine." The admission came out broken, filled with the agony of wanting something she could never have. "But we can't ignore reality. You're an alpha king, and I'm a servant with mongrel blood who scrubs floors for a living. Your blood sings to mine." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. "Whatever you are, whoever you are, you're not mongrel. My beast recognizes royalty when it sees it." The word sent shock through her system, impossible and terrifying, and somehow right in ways she didn't understand. But before she could process what he might mean, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. They sprang apart like guilty children, the golden light fading as quickly as it had appeared. Lady Celeste emerged from the shadows with 2 of her ladies in waiting, her pale gaze taking in the scene with calculating intelligence. "Your Majesty." Her voice was honey over steel. "I was concerned when you weren't in your chambers. The preparations for tomorrow's council meeting require your attention." "Of course." Kyle's transformation back to composed king was so complete it made Lyra's heart ache. "I was merely taking air before retiring." Lady Celeste's gaze flicked to Lyra with barely concealed contempt. "And you, servant, shouldn't you be abed? The kitchens require early rising." "Yes, my lady, forgive me." Lyra dropped into another curtsy, using the gesture to hide the way her hands were still trembling from Kyle's touch. "See that it doesn't happen again. The castle has enough problems without servants wandering the gardens at inappropriate hours." The dismissal was clear, and Lyra fled toward the servants' entrance without looking back. But she could feel Cale's gaze on her retreating form, could sense his wolf's desperate desire to follow her despite the political impossibility of their connection. As she reached the safety of the servants' corridors, one thought echoed through her mind with devastating clarity. The mate bond was real, powerful, and completely forbidden, and no amount of duty or political necessity was going to make it disappear. The elder scholar arrived with the dawn, his ancient carriage rattling through the castle gates like harbinger of secrets long buried. Lyra watched from the kitchen window as servants unloaded trunk after trunk of scrolls and artifacts, their movements careful and reverent around objects that seemed to pulse with their own inner weight. Master Aldrich had served as keeper of royal lineages for longer than most could remember, his wizened face holding knowledge that predated the current dynasty by centuries. "Stop gawking and get back to work," the head cook's sharp voice cut through her fascination. "The coronation ceremony requires precise timing, and I won't have lazy servants disrupting the schedule." But as Lyra returned to her tasks, she couldn't shake the feeling that the scholar's arrival was connected to the strange sensations that had been growing stronger each day. Her wolf had been restless since the moment his carriage appeared, pacing beneath her skin with an urgency that made concentration nearly impossible. That afternoon she was tasked with cleaning the castle library, a duty that usually brought her peace among the towering shelves and ancient tomes. Today, however, the familiar space felt charged with tension, as if the very air held secrets waiting to spill forth. Master Aldrich sat at the great oak table, surrounded by scrolls that seemed older than the castle itself. His gnarled fingers traced delicate script while he muttered under his breath, occasionally pausing to make notes in a leather-bound journal. Lyra moved quietly around the room, dusting shelves while trying not to disturb his important work. "The bloodlines tell such fascinating stories," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent studying forgotten histories. "Particularly when they reveal truths that powerful people have spent generations trying to hide." Alpha King Kyle entered the library with his usual commanding presence, though Lyra noticed the way his gaze immediately sought her out before focusing on the scholar. The mate bond hummed between them like a struck tuning fork, making her wolf press against her ribs with desperate longing. "Master Aldrich." Kyle's greeting was respectful, though Lyra could hear the underlying tension in his voice. "I trust your preparations for the coronation ceremony are progressing well." The old man looked up with eyes that sparkled with ancient intelligence. "Indeed, Your Majesty, though I must confess the research has revealed some unexpected discoveries about the royal bloodlines of this realm." Something in his tone made Lyra's wolf go completely still, as if the beast was holding its breath in anticipation. "What sort of discoveries?" Kyle settled into the chair across from the scholar, his attention fully focused despite the way his awareness continued to track Lyra's movements around the room. "The Lunar Queen dynasty, for instance." Master Aldrich unfurled a scroll covered in intricate genealogical charts. "Most believe that bloodline died out during the War of Shadows when Queen Seraphina and her daughter were killed in the siege of Moonhaven." Lyra's hand stilled on the books she was shelving, her wolf pressing so hard against her consciousness that she nearly gasped aloud. "Most believe that, yes." Kyle's voice remained carefully neutral, though something flickered in his dark eyes. "But royal bloodlines are remarkably resilient, Your Majesty. They have a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to eradicate them." The scholar's finger traced a particular line on the chart, following branches that seemed to disappear and reappear like hidden rivers. The infant princess, for example. The records claim she perished with her mother, but witness accounts tell a different story. "What do you mean?" The question came out rougher than Kyle probably intended, his wolf responding to something in the scholar's words that made his beast pace with increasing agitation. "A nursemaid escaped the castle with a child during the siege. She was seen fleeing toward the thornwood, carrying a babe with the distinctive silver eyes of the Lunar Queen bloodline. Master Aldrich looked up from his scrolls with knowing eyes. That child would have been bound immediately, her power suppressed to keep her hidden from those who would see her dead. The duster fell from Lyra's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Both men turned to look at her, and she felt heat flood her cheeks at the unwanted attention. "Forgive me." She bent to retrieve the duster, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Silver eyes," Master Aldrich mused, studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Such an unusual trait, quite rare outside the old royal bloodlines. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the floor, fighting the urge to flee the library entirely. Her wolf was going insane, clawing at the barriers she had built to contain it, while ancient voices whispered words she couldn't quite understand. The Lunar Queen bloodline was said to carry extraordinary power, the scholar continued, his attention returning to Kyle, though Lyra could feel his awareness of her like a weight against her skin. The ability to command lesser wolves, to see truth through deception, to heal mortal wounds with touch alone. But most importantly, they were the only bloodline that could activate the ancient crown. "Activated how?" Kyle's question was sharp with interest, though Lyra caught the way his nostrils flared slightly, as if he was scenting something that disturbed him. "The crown was never merely ceremonial, Your Majesty. It was a conduit for royal power, a way for true lunar queens to channel the ancient magics that once protected this realm. But it requires royal blood to function, blood that carries the old power." Master Aldrich rolled up the genealogy scroll with careful precision. Without that bloodline, it remains nothing more than beautiful metalwork. Lyra's wolf threw itself against her consciousness with such violence that she stumbled, catching herself against a bookshelf while waves of power crashed through her system. For a terrifying moment, she felt the barriers that had contained her beast for so long beginning to crack, ancient strength bleeding through the cracks like water through a broken dam. "Are you all right?" Kyle was on his feet instantly, moving toward her with the fluid grace of a predator, his wolf responding to her distress with protective instincts that overrode political caution. Fine." The word came out strained, unconvincing, just tired. But Master Aldrich was watching her with eyes that missed nothing, his ancient gaze taking in her silver irises, her trembling hands, the way power seemed to shimmer in the air around her like heat waves. "The crown has been moved to the ceremonial chamber for tomorrow's blessing," he said quietly, his words seeming to carry layers of meaning that made Lyra's skin prickle with awareness. Interesting how some bloodlines respond to proximity to their ancestral artifacts. The implication hit her like a physical blow, the scholar knew. Somehow this ancient keeper of secrets had looked at her and seen past the suppression magic that had hidden her true nature for so long. "I should return to my duties." She managed the words through a throat gone tight with panic, already backing toward the library entrance. "Ah, of course." Master Aldrich's voice followed her retreat, gentle but implacable. "Though I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other soon, child. The coronation has a way of revealing truths that have been hidden too long." Lyra fled the library with her wolf howling in harmony, with voices that sounded like ancient queens, their words growing clearer with each step she took away from the scholar's knowing gaze. The bloodline lives, the power stirs, the crown calls to its rightful bearer. And somewhere in the depths of her suppressed memories, something that had been sleeping for 20 years began to wake. Lady Celeste's smile was razor-sharp as she surveyed the assembled servants in the castle courtyard. "Today we shall remind everyone of their proper place in the natural order," she announced, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that always preceded cruelty. "The coronation approaches, and I will not have the ceremony marred by servants who have forgotten their station." Lyra kept her head down among the crowd of kitchen staff and stable hands, but she could feel Lady Celeste's attention like ice water against her skin. Since Master Aldrich's arrival 3 days ago, the noblewoman's treatment had shifted from casual dismissal to active malice, as if she sensed some threat she couldn't quite name. "You there." The pointed finger found Lyra with unerring accuracy. "Step forward." Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to run with the entire household watching. Lyra moved to the centre of the courtyard, acutely aware of the way conversations had died throughout the castle, as word spread that Lady Celeste was staging another of her public humiliation ceremonies. "Kneel." The command was delivered with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted her right to command lesser beings. Lyra's wolf snarled beneath her skin, pressing against the barriers that contained it with increasing desperation. The beast recognized the dominance display for what it was, and wanted to respond with violence, wanted to show this pretender exactly who was truly worthy of respect. But she forced herself to compliance, dropping to her knees on the cold stone while her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Look around you," Lady Celeste continued, beginning a slow circle around Lyra's kneeling form. "This is what happens when mongrels forget their place, when servants develop inappropriate attachments to their betters." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks as she realized what this was truly about. Somehow, Lady Celeste knew about the garden meeting, about the impossible connection that sparked between her and the Alpha King whenever they were in the same room. "Perhaps you've been harbouring fantasies about rising above your station." Lady Celeste's voice dropped to a whisper meant to carry to every watching servant. "Perhaps you've forgotten that some of us were born to rule while others were born to serve." The humiliation burned through Lyra's chest like acid, made worse by the knowledge that somewhere in the castle, Alpha King Kyle could feel her distress through the mate bond that connected them. She could sense his growing agitation, his wolf responding to her pain with protective rage that he couldn't act upon without revealing their connection. "Tell them what you are," Lady Celeste commanded, stopping directly in front of her. "A servant, my lady." The words tasted like ashes, but Lyra forced them out past the tightness in her throat. "A servant with mongrel blood who scrubs floors and empties chamber pots." Lady Celeste's hand shot out, grasping Lyra's chin and forcing her head up so their eyes met. "A nothing who will always be nothing, no matter what delusions she might entertain." The touch sent fire racing through Lyra's system, but not the golden warmth of mate recognition. This was different, darker, as if Lady Celeste's wolf was trying to force submission through supernatural dominance. Her beast reared up in response, ancient power bleeding through the cracks in her suppression barriers. For a heartbeat, silver light flickered in Lyra's eyes, and Lady Celeste jerked her hand back as if burned. "What?" The noblewoman's composure cracked slightly, uncertainty flickering across her perfect features. Then the courtyard erupted into chaos as Alpha King Kyle appeared at the entrance, his presence hitting the assembled crowd like a physical force. His dark eyes swept the scene, taking in Lyra's kneeling form and Lady Celeste's flushed face, with the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned warriors step back in instinctive fear. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, and every wolf in the courtyard except Lyra immediately dropped into submissive postures. Lady Celeste recovered her composure with practised ease, though Lyra could see the way her hands trembled slightly. "Your Majesty, I was simply reinforcing proper hierarchy among the staff. The coronation requires absolute precision." Kyle's gaze found Lyra's, and the mate bond flared between them with such intensity that she gasped aloud. His wolf was screaming for blood, demanding retribution for the humiliation of his mate, and it took every ounce of his considerable control to maintain his kingly facade. "I see." His words were clipped, dangerous. "And this requires public spectacle?" "Sometimes examples must be made, Your Majesty." Lady Celeste's smile was poisonous sweet. "Surely you understand the importance of maintaining order?" The silence stretched taut as bowstring, while Kyle stared at Lyra's kneeling form. She could feel his internal struggle, the way his beast demanded he cross the courtyard and help her to her feet, the way his rational mind calculated the political cost of showing favouritism to a servant. "Rise," he said finally, the single word carrying enough command to make Lyra's legs obey before her mind could process the order. She stood on shaking legs, hyper-aware of the way every eye in the courtyard tracked the exchange between their king and a lowly servant who should have been beneath his notice. "Return to your duties, all of you." The dismissal was absolute, brooking no argument. As the crowd began to disperse, Lyra caught the moment when Kyle's nostrils flared slightly, scenting something that made his eyes darken with recognition. Her wolf was bleeding through her control, ancient power manifesting as changes so subtle that only another supernatural creature would notice. Lady Celeste noticed. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice pitched for his ears alone, though Lyra's enhanced hearing caught every word. "Perhaps we should discuss the security arrangements for the coronation, privately." It was a clear dismissal, a reminder that she was his intended political partner, while Lyra was nothing more than a servant who had disrupted the natural order. But before Kale could respond, his wolf made the choice for him. He stepped closer to Lyra, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a claiming. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low, but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Are you injured?" The question was simple, appropriate for a king showing concern for his subjects. But the way his eyes burned with protective fury, the way his hands clenched at his sides as if fighting the urge to touch her, the way his wolf pressed against his control with desperate need to comfort his mate, none of that was simple at all. "No, Your Majesty." She managed the words despite the way her throat had gone tight with emotion. "Thank you for your concern." For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they stared at each other while the mate bond hummed between them like a live wire. Then Lady Celeste cleared her throat delicately, and the spell shattered. "The coronation preparations require attention, Your Majesty." The reminder was gentle but pointed, a clear indication that his time was better spent on important matters than servants' welfare. Kyle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he stepped back, putting proper distance between himself and the servant, who was slowly destroying his carefully constructed composure. Of course." He turned toward Lady Celeste, though Lyra caught the way his attention lingered on her retreating form. "We should discuss security." As they walked toward the castle entrance, Lyra heard Lady Celeste's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry back to where she stood. "Some servants require firmer handling, Your Majesty. I hope you'll allow me to ensure such disruptions don't occur again." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Lyra felt ice settle in her stomach as she realized how dangerous her connection to the Alpha King had become. Lady Celeste had noticed the way he looked at her, the way his wolf responded to her distress, and she would not tolerate any challenge to her position as his intended mate. That night, alone in her narrow cot, Lyra pressed her hand to her chest, where the mate bond pulsed with shared pain. Somewhere in the royal wing, Kale was suffering the same agony she felt, the same desperate longing for a connection they could never acknowledge. But Lady Celeste's message had been clear. Any further displays of the impossible bond between them would result in consequences that neither political necessity nor supernatural destiny would be able to prevent. The choice was simple: suppress the mate bond completely, or watch it destroy them both. The poison arrived with the evening meal disguised as kindness. Lyra stared at the covered tray that had been left on her narrow cot, her wolf pacing restlessly beneath her skin. In all her years of servitude, no one had ever brought her food to the servants' quarters. She survived on kitchen scraps and whatever the cook deemed appropriate for the lowest members of the household staff. The accompanying note was written in elegant script on expensive parchment. For your dedicated service during these trying preparations, a small token of appreciation. No signature, but the expensive stationery and perfect penmanship suggested someone from the noble quarters. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the silver dome, revealing roasted fowl in rich gravy, delicate vegetables, and sweet pastries that usually graced only the high table. Her wolf went silent. The sudden stillness from her beast sent alarm racing through her system. Her wolf had been agitated for days, pressing against her consciousness with increasing urgency. But now the creature had gone completely motionless in a way that felt like held breath before a scream. Lyra leaned closer to the food, inhaling deeply. To her human senses, everything smelled perfectly normal. Roasted meat, herbs, butter, honey. But underneath those familiar scents, something else lurked. Something that made her enhanced senses recoil in instinctive revulsion. Nightshade. Just a trace, expertly masked by stronger flavours, but enough to stop a human heart within minutes of consumption. Her wolf erupted back to consciousness with violent force, ancient instincts flooding her system with supernatural awareness. This wasn't random cruelty or a servant's accident. This was deliberate murder, carefully planned and expertly executed. Someone wanted her dead. The realization hit her like a physical blow, followed immediately by a surge of power that she had never felt before. Her suppressed abilities, weakened by years of magical binding, suddenly blazed to life as her wolf took partial control to neutralize the threat. Heat raced through her veins like liquid fire, and she watched in fascination and terror as her hands began to glow with soft silver light. The power flowed from her fingertips into the poisoned food, breaking down the toxic compounds at a molecular level, while her enhanced healing accelerated to process the trace amounts she had already absorbed through scent alone. The transformation was visceral and overwhelming. Her senses sharpened until she could hear conversations 3 floors away, could smell the individual scents of every person who had handled the food tray. Her strength increased dramatically, and when she accidentally gripped the silver dome too tightly, her fingers left dents in the metal. But most importantly, her wolf's voice became crystal clear for the first time in her life. They tried to kill us. The ancient presence snarled with fury that felt older than the castle itself. The pretender seeks to eliminate what she cannot understand. The wolf's consciousness was regal, powerful, nothing like the confused creature that had struggled against magical suppression for 20 years. This was the voice of queens and conquerors, of a bloodline that had ruled these lands when the current nobility were nothing more than ambitious merchants. "What's happening to me?" Lyra's internal question came out as a desperate whisper. "We are awakening," her wolf replied with grim satisfaction. "The barriers that bound us are weakening. Each threat, each moment of mortal danger cracks the chains they use to hide our true nature." Before Lyra could process this revelation fully, the scent of pine and leather announced an approaching presence that made her newly awakened power surge with recognition. Alpha King Kyle was coming, his wolf driving him toward his mate with protective instincts that overrode political caution. She barely had time to hide the evidence of her supernatural manifestation before her door opened without ceremony. Kale stepped into the small servant's chamber like a force of nature, his dark eyes immediately cataloguing every detail of the scene before focusing on her face with laser intensity. "Are you hurt?" The question came out rough with barely contained violence, his wolf responding to her distress through the mate bond that connected them. "I'm fine." But even as she said it, she could see his nostrils flare as he scented the lingering traces of poison and power in the air. His gaze fell on the food tray, and his expression shifted into something that would have terrified armies. "Someone tried to poison you." It wasn't a question. His enhanced senses had already confirmed what her wolf had detected, and the fury radiating from him made the small chamber feel like it might explode from the pressure of his barely leashed violence. "Your Majesty, you shouldn't be here." She tried to inject proper deference into her voice, but the words came out strained. Her newly awakened abilities were making it difficult to maintain the submissive facade that had protected her for so long. "Someone tried to kill my mate." Each word was delivered with controlled precision that made her wolf whimper with recognition and desire. He had acknowledged what they were, had claimed her in the most fundamental way possible, regardless of political consequences. "We can't," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I've assigned guards to watch the servants' quarters." His voice was pure command, the tone of a king who would not be denied. "Discreet protection, but effective. Anyone who approaches you will be monitored." The declaration sent warmth flooding through her chest, her wolf preening at his protective instincts. But it also highlighted the impossible situation they found themselves in. A king providing special protection for a servant would raise questions they couldn't afford to answer. "That will cause talk," she warned, though part of her thrilled at the evidence of his care. "Let them talk." He stepped closer, and she could see the way his hands were clenched into fists, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her. "I will not lose you to some coward's poison." The raw possession in his voice made her newly awakened power respond with silver light that flickered briefly in her eyes. Cale's breath caught as he witnessed the supernatural manifestation, his own wolf surging toward the surface in response. "Your abilities are awakening," he said quietly, his gaze tracking the way power seemed to shimmer in the air around her. "How much do you remember about your origins?" The question hit her like lightning, confirming suspicions she had been afraid to voice. "You know something about what I am." "I know that my wolf recognizes royalty when it encounters it." His voice dropped to a whisper meant for her ears alone. "I know that the mate bond doesn't lie, and it's telling me you're far more than you've been led to believe." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the servants' corridor. Kyle stepped back immediately, putting proper distance between them, though his eyes remained fixed on her face with burning intensity. "The investigation will be thorough," he said, in a voice loud enough to carry, resuming his kingly authority. "I will not tolerate threats against any member of this household." Master Aldrich appeared in the doorway, his ancient eyes taking in the scene with knowing intelligence. "Your Majesty, I heard there was some disturbance. Someone attempted to poison one of the servants." Kyle's tone was ice-cold with fury. "I want every person who had access to this tray questioned." The scholar's gaze found Lyra's, and she saw recognition flicker in his ancient eyes as he noted the lingering traces of power that clung to her like perfume. Most fortunate that the attempt was unsuccessful. Some bloodlines have natural resistances to such crude methods. The loaded words made Lyra's wolf stir restlessly, and she realized that Master Aldrich had known all along what she was, had perhaps been waiting for her abilities to manifest naturally rather than forcing the revelation. "Oh, indeed," Cale replied, though his attention remained focused on Lyra. "We'll discuss security measures further tomorrow. For now, ensure the servants' quarters are properly guarded." As both men departed, Lyra sank onto her cot with shaking hands. The assassination attempt had awakened something inside her that could never be contained again. Her wolf was free, her power was manifesting, and the barriers that had hidden her true nature for 20 years were crumbling with each passing hour. Lady Celeste had tried to eliminate a threat she didn't fully understand. Instead, she had awakened the very power she had sought to destroy. The Lunar Queen bloodline lived, and it was done hiding. The hidden chamber lay beneath the castle foundations, carved from living rock by hands that had shaped stone when the world was younger. Master Aldrich led Lyra downstairs that seemed older than memory. their footsteps echoing in passages that had been forgotten by all but the most ancient bloodlines. The scholar's gnarled fingers traced symbols carved into the walls, activating wards that had slumbered for generations. The Lunar Queens built this sanctuary during the early days of their reign, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper in the sacred space. Here, the royal bloodline could manifest its true power without fear of discovery or interference. Lyra's wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, recognizing something in the ancient stones that made her heritage sing with homecoming. The very air thrummed with residual magic, power that had been woven into the foundations by queens whose names had been lost to history, but whose strength remained embedded in every carved surface. "Why are you showing me this?" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer. The poisoning attempt had accelerated everything, forcing revelations that might have taken months to unfold naturally. Master Aldrich turned to face her in the centre of the circular chamber, his ancient eyes holding knowledge that spanned centuries. "Because you are the last child, the final living heir of a bloodline that once ruled these lands with wisdom and power, and because the time for hiding is over." He began to move around the chamber, lighting candles that had been placed in niches carved specifically for this purpose. As each flame sparked to life, the symbols on the walls began to glow with their own inner light, responding to the presence of royal blood after decades of darkness. "Your mother was Princess Seraphina's daughter," he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of formal revelation. "Born in secret during the siege of Moonhaven, spirited away by loyal servants who died protecting the secret of your existence. You were bound as an infant, your power suppressed so completely that even you didn't know what you truly were." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each revelation restructuring everything she had believed about herself. "That's impossible. I'm nobody, a servant with mongrel blood who carries the most powerful bloodline in the Northern Territories." Master Aldrich's interruption was gentle, but implacable. "Your suppression has been masterfully done, child. Whoever bound your power was skilled enough to hide you from every attempt at detection. But assassination attempts have a way of cracking even the strongest magical barriers." He approached her slowly, his movements careful and reverent. "May I?" At her hesitant nod, he placed his weathered hands on either side of her face, closing his eyes in deep concentration. The moment his skin touched hers, the chamber erupted with silver light so brilliant it drove away every shadow. Ancient power roared through her system like a dam breaking, flooding her consciousness with memories that weren't quite memories, knowledge that belonged to generations of queens who had ruled with supernatural authority. Her wolf threw back its head and howled with joy as barriers that had constrained it for 20 years shattered like glass. "Lunar Queen Lyra Moonborn," Master Aldrich whispered, his voice filled with wonder as he witnessed the awakening of powers that legends were built upon. "Last of the Silver Throne, heir to the Crown of Storms, rightful ruler of the Northern Territories." The transformation was agonizing and ecstatic simultaneously. Power coursed through her veins like molten silver, rewriting her very DNA as suppressed abilities finally found their voice. Her senses exploded outward until she could hear every heartbeat in the castle above, could smell the fear and excitement of nobles gathering for tomorrow's coronation, could feel the ancient crown calling to her from its ceremonial chamber like a beacon in the darkness. But the process was far from complete. Master Aldrich stepped back, his expression grave despite the triumph in his eyes. "The unsealing will take days to finish. Your power has been bound for so long that releasing it all at once would destroy you. We must be patient, careful, deliberate. Days we may not have." The voice that emerged from her throat was different now, touched with the authority of queens and the wisdom of ages. "Lady Celeste grows more desperate, and the coronation approaches." "Indeed." The scholar began preparing materials from an ancient chest, herbs and crystals that hummed with their own inner light. Which is why we must accelerate the process as much as safely possible. But Lyra, you must understand, once this is complete, there will be no hiding what you are. Every supernatural creature in the kingdom will recognize your true nature. The implications hit her like a landslide. Political upheaval, challenges to the established order, potential civil war as factions chose sides between the legitimate heir and the king, who needed strategic alliances to maintain his rule. What about Kale? The question escaped before she could stop it, and she felt heat flood her cheeks at her lack of propriety. Master Aldrich's ancient eyes softened with understanding. The mate bond recognizes no political boundaries, child. Your wolves chose each other before either of you understood the full implications. But a Lunar Queen outranks even an Alpha King by bloodline precedence. You would not be his subject, you would be his equal. The revelation sent shock through her system. Not a servant reaching above her station, but a queen reclaiming her birthright. Not a political liability, but the most powerful ally Kale could possibly claim. "The nobles will never accept it," she whispered, though her wolf was already imagining the look in Kale's eyes when he realized she was truly worthy of the mate bond that connected them. Some will, others will fight. Master Aldrich began the delicate work of adjusting the suppression bindings, loosening them gradually to allow more power to flow without overwhelming her system. But you will not face this alone. The Alpha King's wolf chose you for good reason, and his political acumen will serve you well in the battles ahead. As he worked, power continued to build in her chest, ancient abilities awakening like flowers blooming after a long winter. She could feel the crown calling to her more insistently now, its magic recognizing the approaching presence of its rightful bearer. "There's something else," Master Aldrich said quietly, his hands stilling in their work. "The crown cannot be activated by just any royal blood. It requires the specific bloodline of the Lunar Queens, and it requires a willing acceptance of the power it represents. If you claim it tomorrow, there will be no question of your legitimacy. The entire kingdom will witness the crown's recognition. And if I don't, then Lady Celeste will likely succeed in her next assassination attempt. Kyle will be forced into a political marriage that weakens his rule, and the true royal bloodline will die with you." His words were blunt, uncompromising. "The choice is yours, child, but know that your ancestors' spirits cry out for justice, for the wrongs done to their bloodline to be set right." Above them, the sounds of the castle preparing for tomorrow's coronation filtered down through layers of stone. Nobles positioning themselves for advantage, servants ensuring every detail was perfect, guards maintaining security that had been doubled since the poisoning attempt. And somewhere in the royal wing, Alpha King Kyle was pacing his chambers like a caged wolf, his mate Bond pulling him toward the hidden chamber where his true queen was finally awakening to her power. Lyra closed her eyes and let the ancient magic wash through her, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a crown she had never known she was meant to wear. Tomorrow would bring revelation, confrontation, and the end of 20 years of lies. The Lunar Queen bloodline would rise again, and the Northern Territories would never be the same. The emergency council meeting convened at dawn, nobles gathering in the great hall with the kind of nervous energy that preceded declarations of war. Lady Celeste stood at the centre of the assembly like a golden goddess of righteous fury, her pale blue eyes blazing with conviction as she addressed the most powerful families in the Northern Territories. She had spent the night calling in favours, making promises, and weaving the kind of political web that could strangle kingdoms. "My lords and ladies," her voice carried the perfect balance of authority and wounded dignity, "I come before you today to expose a threat that strikes at the very heart of our realm's stability." Lyra pressed herself against the servant's entrance, her newly awakened senses allowing her to hear every word despite the distance. The power that Master Aldrich had begun unleashing coursed through her system like liquid fire, making her hyper-aware of the tension that filled the great hall like a living thing. For days, rumours have circulated about inappropriate attachments between our Alpha King and a servant of questionable breeding. Lady Celeste's words were carefully chosen, designed to plant seeds of doubt without direct accusation. But the truth is far more sinister than mere impropriety. Lord Blackwood, whose allegiance could tip the balance of power in the Northern Territories, leaned forward with interest. "What are you suggesting, Lady Celeste?" "That dark magic has been employed to seduce our king away from his duty." She let the accusation hang in the air, watching as shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. "That a pretender with mongrel blood has used forbidden arts to ensnare the most powerful man in our realm." The accusation hit Lyra like a physical blow, even as her wolf snarled with indignation. They were twisting the mate bond into something evil, something that threatened the natural order rather than confirming it. "These are serious charges," Duke Ravencrest's gravelly voice cut through the whispers. "Do you have proof of such sorcery?" Lady Celeste's smile was sharp as a blade. "I have witnesses to unnatural phenomena, servants who have seen this woman's eyes glow with silver light, guards who report supernatural strength and impossible survival from what should have been fatal poison. Most damning of all, I have observed our Alpha King's behaviour change from rational leadership to obsessive protection of a single lowly servant." Each word was calculated to destroy any possibility of the truth being accepted. If Lyra revealed her royal bloodline now, it would appear to be exactly the kind of deception Lady Celeste was describing, a desperate lie told by a pretender caught in her web of dark magic. "What do you propose we do?" Lord Ashford's question carried the weight of a man who commanded significant military resources. "I propose trial by combat." Lady Celeste's voice rang with righteous determination. "Let the pretender face a champion of noble blood in single combat. If she is truly innocent of sorcery, the gods will grant her victory. If she is the dark enchantress I believe her to be, justice will be served." The suggestion sent ice through Lyra's veins. Trial by combat was an ancient law, one that couldn't be refused without admitting guilt, but it was also traditionally fought to the death, and Lady Celeste would choose a champion capable of ending the threat to her position permanently. "And if our king objects to this trial?" Duke Ravencrest's question was pointed, acknowledging the political reality that Chael's protection had become increasingly obvious. "Then we will know that the sorcery runs deeper than we feared." Lady Celeste's implication was clear. If Chael defended Lyra, it would prove that he had been compromised by dark magic and was no longer fit to rule. But I believe that once the enchantment is broken by the pretender's death, our Alpha King will return to his senses and fulfill his duty to the realm. The gathered nobles exchanged glances weighted with political calculation. Civil war was expensive, destructive, and unpredictable, but a trial by combat offered a clean resolution that would eliminate the threat while providing legal justification for whatever outcome followed. "I second the proposal," Lord Blackwood declared, his support lending significant weight to Lady Celeste's position. "Let ancient law determine the truth." One by one, the other nobles voiced their agreement, until the great hall resonated with a consensus that felt like a death sentence. Lyra's hands shook as she realized the trap that had been so carefully constructed around her. Refuse the trial and appear guilty of sorcery. Accept it and face almost certain death against a champion specifically chosen to end her life. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race as Alpha King Chael entered the great hall, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from conspiratorial planning to formal presentation. His dark eyes swept the assembly with the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned warriors reconsider their life choices. "Your Majesty," Lady Celeste's curtsy was perfect, respectful, designed to emphasize her position as his intended political partner. We were just discussing matters of security for the coronation ceremony. Security? Cale's voice was dangerously quiet as he took his place at the head of the assembly. And what threats have you identified that require such an early gathering? The question hung in the air while Lady Celeste prepared to spring her carefully constructed trap. The threat of dark magic, Your Majesty, of sorcery used to compromise the judgment of those in positions of authority. Lyra watched from the shadows as Kyle's hands clenched into fists, his wolf responding to the implied insult with barely leashed violence. But she could also see the political calculation in his eyes, the way he was measuring the forces arrayed against him and finding the odds deeply troubling. "You speak of sorcery as if you have evidence," he said carefully. "I have proposed trial by combat to determine the truth." Lady Celeste's words were pitched to carry to every corner of the great hall. Let the accused face a champion in single combat, and let the gods render their judgment. The trap was sprung with surgical precision. Kyle couldn't object without appearing to validate the accusations against him. He couldn't defend Lyra without confirming that his judgment had been compromised, and he couldn't prevent the trial without appearing to be a tyrant who placed personal desires above ancient law. Who stands accused? But even as he asked the question, Lyra could see that he already knew the answer. "The servant known as Lyra," Lady Celeste replied, her voice carrying false sadness at having to name someone so far beneath their notice. "She who has been observed in your private company despite her lowly station." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the great hall turned toward Kyle, waiting to see how their king would respond to this direct challenge to his authority and judgment. Lyra's heart broke as she watched the man she loved realize the impossible position he had been placed in. Political stability demanded he agree to the trial. His kingdom's survival required him to maintain the support of the gathered nobles, but his mate bond screamed at him to protect her at any cost. "When?" The single word came out rough with suppressed emotion. "Tomorrow, after the coronation ceremony." Lady Celeste's timing was perfect, ensuring that the trial would take place when the maximum number of witnesses could observe Cale's reaction to his supposed enchantress's fate. "Let your official crowning be followed immediately by the cleansing of dark magic from our realm." Cale's gaze found the shadows where Lyra stood hidden, their eyes meeting across the distance with the kind of desperate communication that needed no words. She could see his internal war, the way his every instinct demanded he cross the hall and claim her publicly, regardless of consequences. Instead, he gave the barest nod of agreement. "So be it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a king who had just signed his mate's death warrant. "Let ancient law determine the truth." As the assembly began to disperse, making plans for the spectacle that would determine the kingdom's future, Lyra slipped away through the servants' corridors, with her heart shattered and her wolf howling for vengeance. The trap had been sprung perfectly. Tomorrow would bring coronation, trial, and almost certainly death. Unless the Lunar Queen bloodline proved stronger than the forces arrayed against it. The engagement announcement echoed through the castle like a death knell, each word driving daggers through the mate bond that connected two hearts being torn apart by political necessity. Lyra stood in the shadows of the great hall's upper gallery, her newly awakened senses making every detail of the ceremony below painfully vivid. The assembled nobles had gathered in their finest attire, witnessing what they believed to be the resolution of their kingdom's political future through strategic alliance. Alpha King Kyle stood at the centre of the spectacle, magnificent in royal blue and silver, his presence commanding even as his soul was being systematically destroyed. Lady Celeste beside him was radiant in cloth of gold, her perfect smile masking the triumph that blazed in her pale eyes. "By the ancient laws of our realm," Cale's voice carried clearly through the vast space, though Lyra could hear the underlying strain that no one else would detect. I pledge myself to Lady Celeste of House Wintermoon, securing the alliance that will strengthen the Northern Territories for generations to come." The betrothal ring caught the light as he slipped it onto her finger, the ceremonial gold band that bound him to a future that felt like a cage. Lady Celeste's curtsy was perfect, graceful, designed to emphasize her worthiness to stand beside a king, while the crowd erupted in applause. Through the mate bond, Lyra felt every moment of Kyle's agony as if it were her own. The supernatural connection between them stretched and twisted under the strain of denial, sending waves of pain through both their systems that no amount of political necessity could ease. Her wolf threw back its head and howled silently, the sound echoing through her consciousness with such anguish that she pressed her hands against her chest to keep from crying out. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to leap from the gallery and claim her mate publicly, regardless of consequences. Instead, she forced herself to remain hidden while her heart shattered with each word of the ceremony below. "The coronation tomorrow will be followed by the formal wedding ceremony," Lady Celeste announced, her voice carrying the sweetness of victory. "I am honoured to serve as your Lunar Queen, to stand beside our Alpha King as we guide the realm toward prosperity." The title that should have been Lyra's by birthright was being claimed by the woman who had orchestrated this entire political coup, Lunar Queen. The irony was bitter enough to choke on, considering that Lyra was the actual heir to that ancient authority, while Celeste was nothing more than an ambitious noble with delusions of worthiness. As the ceremony concluded and nobles began to offer congratulations, Lyra slipped away from her hiding place with her newly enhanced abilities, making every movement silent as shadows. The castle corridors blurred past her as she fled toward the only sanctuary that remained, the hidden chamber where Master Aldrich was preparing her for tomorrow's trial. She found the ancient scholar surrounded by weapons and armour that seemed to glow with their own inner light, artifacts that had been forged specifically for the Lunar Queen bloodline during the height of their power. "I felt your pain through the castle's very stones," he said quietly without looking up from his work. "The mate bond is not easily ignored, even under magical suppression." He had no choice. The words came out broken, filled with the agony of understanding political reality, while her heart demanded impossible things. The nobles would have declared him unfit to rule if he'd refused the engagement. Perhaps. Master Aldrich lifted a sword that seemed to be made of crystallized moonlight, its blade humming with ancient power. But tomorrow's trial changes everything. Win, and you prove your worthiness to claim what was always yours. Lose, and his political marriage becomes meaningless because his mate will be dead. The brutal honesty hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the pain of watching Kyle pledge himself to another woman that she had almost forgotten the trial by combat that would likely end her life within hours. "Tell me about my opponent." She forced herself to focus on practical matters, pushing aside the emotional devastation to concentrate on survival. Sir Marcus Blackthorne. The scholar's expression was grim as he named her champion adversary. Lady Celeste chose well. He's a professional killer who has never lost a formal duel, enhanced with enough supernatural strength to match most alphas in single combat. More importantly, he believes completely in the cause he's fighting for. The cause? That you're a dark sorceress who has bewitched his king through forbidden magic. Master Aldrich began fitting pieces of ancient armour to her frame, the metal adjusting itself to her body as if it recognised her bloodline. "He genuinely thinks killing you will save the realm from corruption." The revelation sent ice through her veins. She had expected to face a mercenary, someone fighting for gold rather than conviction. A true believer would be far more dangerous, driven by righteous fury rather than mere professional competence. "Can I win?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "Your power is still awakening, the unsealing process only half complete." His weathered hands adjusted the sword belt around her waist, the ancient weapon settling against her hip like it belonged there. but you carry the blood of queens who conquered armies and tamed dragons. More importantly, you'll be fighting for your mate, your throne, and your very survival." As he worked, Master Aldrich began explaining the combat techniques that were part of her heritage, abilities that had been suppressed along with her supernatural strength, but were beginning to emerge as the magical bindings weakened. The Lunar Queen fighting style is built on speed, precision, and the ability to channel power through weapons forged specifically for your bloodline. He demonstrated basic forms that felt familiar despite never having learned them. Your enhanced reflexes will let you see attacks before they land, and your supernatural strength will allow you to fight opponents twice your size. But even as he taught her, Lyra could see the concern in his ancient eyes. Half-awakened power against a professional killer was still a desperate gamble, and they both knew that her chances of survival were marginal at best. "There's something else," she said quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing since the engagement ceremony. "Even if I win the trial, even if I prove I'm not a dark sorceress, what happens then? Kyle is still bound to Lady Celeste by political necessity." Master Aldrich's smile was knowing, touched with ancient wisdom. "The trial by combat has very specific rules, child. If you win, it proves not only your innocence but your worthiness. And a Lunar Queen who proves her bloodline through trial has the right to claim her mate publicly, regardless of prior political arrangements." The revelation hit her like lightning. The trial wasn't just about survival. It was about establishing her legal right to challenge the engagement that was tearing her heart apart. "The ancient laws supersede political convenience," the scholar continued. "If you survive tomorrow's combat and the crown accepts you as the rightful Lunar Queen, no noble faction can object to your claim on the Alpha King. The mate bond will be legally recognized, and your bloodline will trump their political maneuvering." Hope bloomed in her chest for the first time since the engagement ceremony, fragile but real. Win the trial, claim the crown, save her mate, and reclaim her throne. All she had to do was survive combat against a professional killer while her power was only half awakened. "Get some rest," Master Aldrich advised, though his eyes held the weight of someone who knew that sleep was unlikely. "Tomorrow will test everything you are and everything you might become. The Lunar Queen bloodline has never failed when the stakes were highest." As Lyra settled into the chamber's alcove, trying to find peace before the battle that would determine her fate, she could feel Kyle's presence through their bond. Somewhere above, he was pacing his chambers like a caged wolf, his mate bond pulling him toward her while political duty demanded he maintain distance. Tomorrow would bring coronation, combat, and the final reckoning between love and power that would reshape the Northern Territories forever. The Lunar Queen would rise, or she would die trying.